The night was colder than most, the kind of chill that crept into the bones and refused to let go. In the narrow lanes of Hammersmith, darkness was not just the absence of light, it felt alive. People said it whispered in the hedges, lingered among the leaning gravestones, and clung to the fog that rolled in from the Thames. This was London's edge in the early 19th century, a place where the growing city smoke smudged the horizon, but where farms, orchards, and fields still stubbornly held their ground. Life in the village was modest. Barges crawled along the wide brown river, pulled by men and horses. The morning air smelled of damp brick, fresh milk in tin pails, and coal smoke from hearths. Blacksmiths hammered iron in their yards. Brewers rolled heavy carts through cobblestone lanes, and the cries of geese echoed across the fields. Yet as ordinary as it seemed by day, Hammersmith changed once the sun sank low. The streets grew silent. Lamps were few and weak, their faint glow swallowed by hedges and unpaved roads. The mist thickened around the churchyard, rising white and restless between the gravestones of St. Paul's and St. Peter's. Families barred their doors early, whispering prayers, for they knew what prowled the village when night came. They called it the Hammersmith ghost. It was in November of 1803, at the edge of a bitter winter, that the first whispers began. The villagers spoke of a figure haunting the lanes after dark, drifting among the tombstones, startling travelers who dared to pass near the churchyard. Many believed it was the restless soul of a man who had died by his own hand the year before, buried in consecrated ground against old superstitions. They said his spirit could not rest, condemned to wander in misery, bound forever to the cold stones of Hammersmith. The stories spread like fire through dry grass. Witnesses swore the ghost glided silently across the fields, wrapped in a white shroud, its movements unnatural, almost too smooth for human limbs. Some described horns and glowing eyes. Others claimed it had the shape of a headless horse, and a few even swore it resembled the hated figure of Napoleon, Britain's enemy of the time. The contradictions did not calm fears, they fed them. To the villagers, the shifting descriptions proved the ghost could change its form at will. Still, a more common image began to take hold, that of a tall man draped in a white sheet, the classic vision of a ghost. Simple though it sounds to modern ears, to the people of Hammersmith it was a terror all too real. They did not believe it was a prank or a man in disguise. They locked their doors each night, convinced that to step outside after sundown was to invite doom. By December, the fear had grown so great that newspapers beyond Hammersmith carried the story. Londoners read in fascination about the haunted lanes just beyond their city. It was becoming more than a village tale. It was a national curiosity. On the 15th of December, a servant boy named Thomas Groom became one of the first named witnesses. That night he and a companion chose to take the churchyard as a shortcut home. The mist hung low, the air heavy with silence. Groom walked behind, his hands in his pockets, when he suddenly felt strong hands grip his shoulders. He spun in shock, but saw no one. In terror, he shouted to his companion, who only stared at him in confusion. Then the invisible grip shifted from Groom's shoulders to his throat. He was choking, strangled by something unseen. Desperate, he lashed out. His fist struck something soft, like a cloak, though there was nothing visible before him. The phantoms. Grip loosened, and Groom staggered back before bolting with his friend into the night. The story would spread quickly, some retellings claiming horns and cloven feet, others that Groom lay bedridden for days. Whatever the details, the villagers believed the ghost had struck, and Thomas Groom was not the only one. A few nights later, a young pregnant woman walked alone past the churchyard. Her steps were slow, her coat drawn tightly against the winter cold. Perhaps she thought of the tailies as she crossed the lane, her mind restless with images of pale figures gliding from the tombstones. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A white shape rose from the graves. Her scream split the silence. She tried to run, but the phantom moved faster, chasing her down in an instant. She felt its arms wrap around her, heavy and cold, before the world went black. Hours later, 2 men found her unconscious on the roadside. She lived long enough to tell her family she had been touched by something from the grave, then slipped into bed and never woke again. The reports kept coming. Coach drivers spoke of their horses rearing in terror at the sight of the ghost, some bolting down the road uncontrollably. One account told of a coach carrying 16 passengers. The driver saw a pale figure ahead, panicked, and leapt from his seat, leaving horses and travelers stranded in the darkness. The ghost vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, but the fear it left behind was real enough. There were misidentifications, too, though these did little to calm the hysteria. A chimney sweep once swore he had seen the ghost beneath a tree. Armed with a stick, he approached cautiously, only to find, after much poking and a sudden shriek, that it was no spirit at all, but a couple hidden beneath a large coat. Another prank involved a butcher's apprentice, caught wearing women's clothes in the graveyard, hoping to scare a maid. Yet the villagers found no humor in these revelations. The ghost, they insisted, was real. By late December, the sightings reached a fever pitch. One night, William Girdler, a local night watchman, encountered a shoemaker's apprentice running in terror, insisting he had seen the ghost. Moments later, Girdler himself glimpsed a figure in white sprinting across the lane. He noticed something odd. The apparition gathered its sheet beneath a coat before vanishing. To Girdler, this suggested it was no spirit, but a man in disguise. But whether ghost or prankster, the people of Hammersmith had had enough. Fear turned into anger. Men began patrolling the lanes after dark, determined to catch the ghost. Some carried clubs, others firearms. They hunted not just a phantom, but anyone bold enough to mock their terror. And it was during one of these hunts that a decision would be made, a decision that would end not in laughter at a prank, but in blood. For on the night of January 3rd, 1804, a gunshot rang out on Black Lion Lane. The Hammersmith ghost, whether real or imagined, would claim its first human victim. The new year had just begun. January of 1804 carried with it an icy stillness, a season when the fog seemed to thicken and the shadows of Hammersmith grew heavier still. By this time, the ghost stories had twisted the village into a state of near panic. Families no longer treated the tales as superstition. They believed them. Fear had become routine. Once darkness fell, streets emptied, doors bolted shut, and windows stayed shuttered until the morning bells. But fear has a strange way of giving birth to defiance. And for some men in the village, it was no longer enough to hide. Groups of locals, often armed and sometimes fueled by ale, began to patrol the lanes at night. Their mission: to hunt the ghost that had humiliated their community and frightened their families. The village no longer waited for the authorities. They took matters into their own hands. One of those men was Francis Smith. Smith was 29 years old, a respectable tradesman, ordinary in nearly every way. But the weeks of fear and chaos had worn him down. The endless rumors, the screaming witnesses, the dread that wrapped around Hammersmith like the fog, it had become unbearable. To him, the village needed action, not whispers. And so, on the evening of January 3rd, 1804, Smith armed himself with a shotgun and walked into the night. He was not entirely alone. Earlier that evening, he had spoken with William Girdler, the village night watchman. Together, they had searched the darkened streets for any sign of the ghost. But as the night wore on, Girdler left to continue his official duties, promising to return later. The two men agreed on a simple call and response to identify each other in the dark. One would shout, "Friend," and the other would reply, "Advance, friend." And so Francis Smith remained, alone, on Black Lion Lane. It was a desolate stretch, running beside the St. Peter's churchyard. Tall hedges lined either side, swallowing what little moonlight trickled down. It was the kind of lane where even the bravest villagers avoided walking after sundown. Tonight it was silent except for the faint crunch of Smith's boots on the frozen ground. Then he heard it, a rustling in the hedge, the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving close by. He froze, tightening his grip on the shotgun. Out of the darkness, a figure emerged. At first, only an outline, vague, shrouded, moving slowly down the lane. But as it drew nearer, Smith's heart pounded. The figure was white from head to toe. The ghost. "Damn you! Who are you?" Smith shouted into the night, his voice trembling between anger and fear. "What are you?" The figure gave no reply. It moved closer, its shape pale and indistinct in the dark. Smith's panic rose. "Damn you, I will shoot you," he warned again, raising his weapon. Still, the figure said nothing. And then, without waiting another moment, Francis Smith pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the empty lane, shattering the silence. The white figure dropped instantly to the ground. Smoke drifted from Smith's gun as the realization began to seep in. He stepped forward cautiously, each breath sharp in the frigid air. The shape lay still, its white clothing stained and torn. Smith's confidence faltered as he looked down, his eyes widening. It was no ghost at all. It was a man, and his name was Thomas Millwood. Millwood was a 22-year-old bricklayer, known around Hammersmith for his plain white working clothes, linen trousers, a linen waistcoat, and a white apron. It was the uniform of his trade, but in the fearful imagination of the villagers, his pale attire had made him a target of suspicion. More than once, he had been mistaken for the ghost while walking home at night. In fact, some weeks earlier, a carriage had stopped suddenly at the sight of him, and a terrified passenger had shouted, "There goes the ghost." Millwood had laughed it off, insisting he was no phantom, and even joked that he might punch the accuser for such nonsense. But his family had worried. They begged him to wear a darker coat over his white clothes to avoid further trouble. Millwood dismissed their fears as foolish. Why should he change his attire for the sake of village hysteria? To him, the ghost was just a tale. But that refusal, born from pride and reason, would cost him his life. On that night, January 3rd, Millwood had stopped at his parents' house along Black Lion Lane to visit his sister, Anne. He lingered a while before heading back into the darkness, intending to meet his wife after her work. Moments later, Anne heard a loud shout followed by the crack of a gunshot. She rushed to the window, but the street outside was silent. Alarmed, she tried to wake her parents, who dismissed her fears. Then she turned to the lodger in the house, but he too brushed her off. Alone, Anne ran into the freezing night. She found her brother lying in the road, blood pooling beneath him. His face was blackened with powder burns, his jaw shattered. Fatal bullet lodged deep within his spine. Thomas Millwood was dead before she reached him. Francis Smith, realizing what he had done, was overwhelmed with horror. In a daze, he stumbled back to the nearest pub and found William Girdler. Breathless and shaking, Smith confessed he had shot the ghost. Girdler was stunned, but insisted they return at once. Accompanied by two other men, they walked back to Black Lion Lane and discovered Millwood's body exactly where Anne had left him. Smith was crushed. Whatever his intentions that night, whether to protect his neighbors, to prove his bravery, or simply to rid Hammersmith of fear, he had killed an innocent man, not even one pretending to be a ghost, but a young bricklayer on his way to see his wife. The body was carried to the Black Lion pub, where it remained until the authorities arrived the following morning. The coroner's inquiry was grim. A single bullet had ended Millwood's life, and in the eyes of the law, there was no ghost to blame. Only Francis Smith stood accused. Yet even as the inquiry unfolded, a startling twist emerged. A local shoemaker, John Graham, stepped forward with a confession. He admitted that on at least one occasion, he had disguised himself in a white sheet to scare his apprentice, who had been frightening Graham's children with ghost stories. He swore he only did it once, never meaning to terrify the entire parish, and certainly not intending to set off a chain of events that would end in death. But by then, the damage was done. The Hammersmith ghost, whether born from Ground's prank, villagers' imagination, or something darker, had claimed its first victim. And Francis Smith would now stand trial for murder. The villagers who once begged for someone to stop the ghost now faced a new question. Was Smith a hero who acted in fear, or a reckless killer who pulled the trigger too quickly? The answer would shake not only Hammersmith, but the entire country, forcing Britain's courts to confront a question they had never faced before. If a man truly believes he is shooting a ghost, is it still murder? And as the court prepared for Smith's trial, the haunting of Hammersmith took on a chilling new form, not as a ghost story, but as a story of blood and law. The morning after the shooting, Hammersmith awoke to a silence heavier than the fog itself. Word spread quickly that the so-called ghost had been shot, and that the figure was no ghost at all, but Thomas Millwood, a young bricklayer. The shock was indescribable. For weeks, villagers had whispered of phantoms and shadows, but now there was a body lying cold in the pub. The legend of the Hammersmith ghost had crossed into grim reality, and the village would never see the story the same way again. Francis Smith, shaken to his core, did not flee. He knew there was no escaping what he had done. That same morning, he surrendered himself to the authorities. His face was pale, his voice unsteady. He admitted to pulling the trigger, but insisted it was a tragic mistake. He had believed he was aiming at a ghost. To his neighbors, Smith was no hardened criminal. He was one of their own. But to the law, the matter was far less forgiving. A man lay dead, and someone had to answer for it. The body of Thomas Millwood was examined carefully. Powder burns marked his face, the close-range shot shattering his jaw and embedding itself in his spine. The death was immediate, brutal, and final. The coroner expressed open astonishment that such an act could happen in an age calling itself enlightened. The inquiry, attended by locals and officials alike, carried an air of disdain for what the coroner saw as foolish superstition. To him, the real tragedy was not just the death of Millwood, but the hysteria that had led to it. But the hysteria had not come from nowhere. Witnesses stepped forward, recounting their encounters with the phantom. Stories of attacks, of choking, hands, of women collapsing in terror, of coachmen abandoning their horse. All of these painted a picture of a village under siege by fear itself. And then came John Graham, the shoemaker. Graham admitted that weeks earlier he had played a prank on his apprentice, draping himself in a white sheet to frighten the boy. He claimed his motive was simple revenge. The apprentice had been scaring Graham's children with ghost tales, scratching at their walls at night. So Graham had turned the tables. He insisted it was only once, but to many in the inquiry, this confession was enough. In their eyes, Graham was the spark that ignited the blaze of hysteria. But one prank did not explain the countless sightings, nor did it bring Thomas Millwood back to life. The coroner concluded the case had no easy resolution. What remained? Clear was that Francis Smith had killed an innocent man, believing him to be something that did not exist. And so, the matter was bound for trial at the Old Bailey. The announcement gripped not only Hammersmith, but all of London. Newspapers carried the story with relish. The Hammersmith ghost murder, they called it. For readers across the city, it was the perfect mixture of Gothic horror and legal intrigue, a tale of superstition colliding with modern justice. Could a man be held guilty of murder if he truly believed he had been fighting a ghost? It was a question no English court had ever confronted before. On January 13, 1804, Francis Smith stood before the court. The Old Bailey was packed with spectators eager to hear the outcome of this bizarre case. Smith, thin and weary, looked broken, unable to stand without assistance. He pleaded not guilty, not because he denied firing the gun, but because he insisted he had not meant to kill a man. He had meant to rid his village of a ghost. His remorse was evident. Witnesses described him as barely able to speak, his voice faltering whenever he was asked to recall the night. He repeated again and again that he had shouted warnings before pulling the trigger, convinced the figure before him was supernatural. His defense was simple. He had acted in fear, not malice. The court listened patiently, but the law had little room for ghosts. Anne Millwood, Thomas's sister, gave a heartbreaking testimony. She recounted hearing the shout and gunshot, how she had found her brother's body, and how little time there had been for him to respond to Smith's call. To her, the tragedy was clear. Smith had acted too quickly. No matter what he believed, her brother had not been given a chance to save his own life. Lord Chief Baron MacDonald, presiding over the trial, addressed the jury with stern clarity. He reminded them that English law could not bend to superstition. Even if Smith had mistaken Millwood for a ghost or a robber, the fact remained: he had taken the life of a man. If every mistaken belief excused murder, then the rule of law itself would unravel. Nothing in this case, the judge declared, can make the offense anything but murder. The jury, however, was torn. They sympathized with Smith. They saw his grief, his genuine belief, and the madness that had engulfed Hammersmith. After an hour's deliberation, they returned with a verdict of manslaughter, but the judge refused to accept it. Manslaughter was not an option in this case. He ruled it was either murder or acquittal. Forced to reconsider, the jury reluctantly declared Francis Smith guilty of murder. The punishment was swift and severe. Smith was sentenced to death by hanging, his body to be delivered afterward for dissection and medical study. The words crushed him. In the courtroom, he wept openly as the verdict was read, his life seemingly over. Yet even as the gavel fell, doubts lingered in the minds of those present. Many could not shake the feeling that Smith's case was unique, that his mistake was unlike ordinary crime. He had not hunted Millwood out of malice or greed. He had not killed in rage or spite. He had acted under the grip of collective fear, a victim of hysteria as much as its enforcer. Could such a man truly deserve the gallows? In the days that followed, the case spread even further, igniting debates in parlors, pubs, and print shops across Britain. Was it justice to execute a man who believed in a ghost? Or was it cruelty to punish him, as though superstition and fear played no role? The question reached beyond Hammersmith. It touched upon something larger, the struggle of an age caught between enlightenment and tradition, between reason and belief. The ghost may have been only a story, but its shadow stretched into the highest levels of law. Francis Smith awaited his fate, his final days clouded by despair. Yet the story was not finished. For as London buzzed with speculation, whispers reached the ears of a far greater authority, King George III himself. And soon, the fate of Francis Smith would be decided, not only by judges and juries, but by the Crown of England. The verdict at the Old Bailey struck the public like a thunderclap. Francis Smith, an ordinary tradesman, a man who had believed he was fighting a ghost, was condemned to die. The sentence was clear. He would be hanged the following Monday, and afterward his body would be handed over for dissection. To many, It seemed a punishment both cruel and inevitable. A man was dead, and the law demanded balance. Yet outside the court, there was unrest. The villagers who had lived through the terror of the Hammersmith ghost did not see Smith as a villain. They saw a man swept up in the same fear that had gripped them all. He had not meant to kill Thomas Millwood. He had meant to defend his community. And while his gunshot had unleashed tragedy, the people could not help but feel pity. In the days that followed, newspapers churned with debate. Writers pondered whether justice had truly been served. Could a man acting under a genuine, if misguided, belief be treated the same as a cold-blooded killer? Should superstition, fear, and mass hysteria count for nothing in the eyes of the law? These were not just idle questions. They cut to the very heart of British justice. And soon they reached the ears of King George III. The king, already a figure of fascination for his turbulent reign, was presented with the case. Advisers laid out the facts. A ghost story, a village in fear, a mistaken shooting. For a monarch steeped in the ideals of both tradition and enlightenment, the matter was a curious one. Here was not a common crime of theft or murder, but a tragedy, born from superstition. To execute Smith would satisfy the letter of the law, but would it satisfy the spirit of justice? After consideration, the king intervened. He chose mercy. Francis Smith's death sentence was commuted to a year of hard labor. Instead of the gallows, he would serve time in punishment and reflection. It was not freedom, but it was life. The decision rippled across the country. Some praised the king's wisdom, seeing his pardon as a necessary balance between justice and compassion. Others criticized it, fearing it undermined the law. But for Smith himself, it was salvation. From the shadow of the noose, he had been pulled back into the world of the living. Still, the debates raged on. What did the case truly mean? Lawyers, scholars, and ordinary citizens alike wrestled with the question. If Smith had truly believed he was aiming at a ghost, could he be guilty of murder? The law said yes. Belief, however mistaken, did not excuse taking a life, but to many, this answer felt unsatisfying. It seemed to ignore the unique circumstances, the hysteria, the fear, the collective delusion that had swept through Hammersmith. The case became a landmark, cited in legal circles for decades afterward. It raised the thorny issue of mistaken law. Could someone be excused if their actions were based on a false belief? In Smith's time, the answer was harsh and simple. No. Only in the late 20th century, nearly 2 centuries later, would British law finally grapple fully with the implications of mistaken belief in cases of self-defense. Until then, Smith's trial lingered as a haunting reminder of the limits of justice. But what of the ghost itself? With the trial concluded and Smith's fate sealed, many expected the sightings to vanish. After all, the ghost was never caught because it had never truly existed. Yet rumors persisted. Some villagers insisted they still saw a pale figure wandering the churchyard at night. Others claimed to hear whispers in the mist, the sound of footsteps trailing them down empty lanes. Whether born of imagination or something darker, the Hammersmith ghost refused to rest. And for some, the true haunting was not the specter at all, but the tragedy of Thomas Millwood. His life had been taken not by a spirit, but by fear. His family mourned in silence, his name etched into the village's memory, not for the bricks he laid, but for the ghost he never was. In a cruel twist of fate, Millwood himself became the closest thing to a ghost that Hammersmith would ever know, an innocent man condemned to haunt the story forever. Meanwhile, whispers of John Graham, the shoemaker who had admitted to donning a sheet, still circulated. Though he claimed it was a single prank, many believed his foolish act had set the stage for everything that followed. Graham himself could not escape the irony. Weeks after Smith's trial, he stood in the church choir, singing at the funeral. of the very man whose death had been tied, however indirectly, to his own prank. The mournful hymns carried a weight no songbook could bear, for the man who had played ghost now sang for the ghost's victim. The case left scars far beyond Hammersmith. It unsettled the nation's sense of progress. England prided itself on being an enlightened society, a place of reason and law. Yet here was proof that fear and superstition could still drive men to deadly acts. The Hammersmith ghost was not just a story of a haunting. It was a mirror held up to society, reflecting the tension between the old world of folklore and the thus new world of rational thought. And even though Francis Smith's life had been spared, the ghost's shadow lingered. The villagers still whispered of strange sightings. Travelers spoke of a white figure darting through the mist. And rumors grew that the haunting would never truly end, that Millwood himself now walked the churchyard, doomed to drift forever in the place where fear and folly had stolen his life. The Hammersmith ghost had begun as a tale of superstition. It had become a tale of tragedy. Now, in the aftermath of Smith's trial, it was something more. A legend. A story retold in pubs and papers. A warning passed down through generations. And a reminder of how easily fear can tip into madness. And, though King George's pardon had closed one chapter, the story was far from over. For in the years to come, the ghost of Hammersmith would rise again, its form shifting, its legend growing, until it became part of something far greater, something that would stalk England for decades to come. For a time, it seemed the Hammersmith ghost had been buried with the verdict. Francis Smith had been spared the gallows, Thomas Millwood laid to rest, and John Graham's foolish prank exposed. To outsiders, the case was closed, its lessons a curiosity for lawyers and scholars. Yet in Hammersmith itself, the ghost refused to stay gone. The villagers still walked with unease after dark. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the churchyard. Men crossing the lanes alone swore. They heard footsteps in the mist. Though rational minds insisted it was imagination, there were too many whispers, too many glances over shoulders, too many stories told in hushed voices for comfort. Some said they had glimpsed a pale figure near St. Paul's Church, slipping silently between gravestones. Others claimed to see a flash of white vanish into the hedges of Black Lion Lane. The tales were never the same, sometimes a tall shape draped in cloth, sometimes a faceless shadow glowing in moonlight, but all carried the same message. The ghost was not finished. For some, the answer was simple. The true ghost of Hammersmith was no longer a prankster in a sheet, but Thomas Millwood himself. Shot down in the lane where he had walked countless times before, his spirit was said to linger, restless and vengeful. Perhaps, some muttered, there wasn't a ghost before he died, but there is one now. In the months that followed, the story deepened its roots. At the Black Lion pub, where Millwood's body had once been carried, strange noises were reported. Patrons spoke of cold spots in the room where he had lain. A few swore they saw his reflection in the glass of the tavern's windows, eyes sunken, jaw broken, face darkened by powder burns. The pub became a place not only to drink, but to gossip about the haunting. To this day, locals say the Black Lion keeps that ghost among its walls. But it wasn't only Hammersmith that carried the legend forward. Across London, ghost stories found fertile ground in the growing appetite for the macabre. Pamphlets and papers retold the Hammersmith affair as both a cautionary tale and a thrill. It was repeated at firesides, in drawing rooms, and in back alleys, often exaggerated, always unsettling. The idea of a ghost leading to a murder was too strange to be forgotten. Even years later, echoes of the tale surfaced. In 1824, 2 decades after the shooting, reports spread of another phantom in the area, this one described as having hooks for hands, able to breathe fire. It was blamed on a farmer playing tricks, though the details remain murky. Then, in later decades, new sightings of white-clad figures were reported around London. These ghosts were said to leap over hedges, claw up walls, and vanish across rooftops. To many, these later accounts sounded eerily familiar. The ghost of Hammersmith seemed to have transformed, reshaping itself into a new legend, the infamous Spring-Heeled Jack. Spring-Heeled Jack burst into Victorian folklore in the 1830s, described as a terrifying figure with glowing red eyes, clawed hands, and the ability to leap impossible heights. Women claimed he tore at their clothes with steel claws. Men swore they saw him vanish into the night with inhuman agility. Some even said he spat blue flames. Though no one was ever caught, the resemblance to earlier tales, the pale figure, the sudden leaps, the terrifying confrontations suggested to many that the Hammersmith ghost was its precursor. Whether coincidence or connection, the idea was irresistible. The first ghost of Hammersmith had grown into a demon of the city, evolving with each retelling. Fear had given it life, and imagination had kept it alive. But even without these later legends, the Hammersmith affair lingered as a wound in the village itself. Families still mourned. Millwood's sister Anne carried the trauma of finding her brother's lifeless body on the road. Francis Smith, though spared execution, bore the weight of his actions until his death. And John Graham lived under the shadow of knowing his prank, however small, had helped ignite a hysteria that ended in blood. The legal world, too, did not forget. For decades, courts cited the case whenever questions arose about mistaken belief. Could a man who acted under false impressions escape guilt? Again and again, the Hammersmith ghost murder was raised as an example. Its lesson was clear. The law did not bend for ghosts. Yet for the people who walked the lanes of Hammersmith at night, the law was not the point. The mist still rose from the Thames, curling around the gravestones, the hedges along Black Lion, lanes still closed in like walls of shadow. And in that silence, many swore they could hear something, a whisper, a footstep, the brush of cloth against stone. The ghost, they said, was still there. What is most chilling is how such tales endure. A prank meant to frighten a single apprentice became a story that outlived the men who began it. Fear twisted into rumor, rumor into hysteria, hysteria into tragedy. And from tragedy, a legend was born. The Hammersmith ghost was no longer just a figure gliding through mist. It was a symbol of how belief itself can kill. Even today, more than 2 centuries later, the story has not been laid to rest. The Black Lion pub still stands, proudly displaying a sign that commemorates the tale. Visitors come to drink, to talk, and sometimes to wonder if the ghost lingers still. Tour guides speak of the churchyard, pointing out where Millwood fell. And on certain nights, when the air is cold and the fog lies heavy, locals claim the old fear returns, that somewhere in the shadows, a white figure waits. Perhaps it is only imagination. Perhaps it is only the echo of an old story told too many times. But perhaps, just perhaps, the Hammersmith ghost still walks. For legends such as these are never truly buried. They slip between the cracks of history, kept alive in whispers and shadows. And whether the figure was a prankster, a mistaken man in white clothes, or something unexplainable, the haunting remains. In the end, a Hammersmith ghost is not just a tale of the past. It is a warning that fear can shape reality, that superstition can spill blood, and that once a ghost is born, whether of flesh or of memory, it is nearly impossible to silence. And so, long after the gunshot faded, long after King George's pardon, long after the graves had settled, the whispers in Hammersmith carried on. The lane still darkened, the mist still rose, and the ghost still lingered, not in one form, but in many, always shifting, always waiting, because in the heart of every fearful silence there is a ghost. The Hammersmith ghost may have started as a shadow in the mist, but its legacy stretched far beyond the churchyard. What had begun as a tale of fear and superstition ended with a courtroom drama that forced Britain to confront questions its legal system had never answered. And even though Francis Smith was spared the noose by King George's mercy, the ghost had left behind a thorny puzzle for the law. What happens when someone kills in the grip of a mistaken belief? For lawyers and judges of the 19th century, the case became a touchstone. They returned to it again and again, trying to untangle its meaning. To the public, it was remembered as a ghost story. But to the courts, it was remembered as something else. The moment the law had to reckon with fear itself, at the heart of the debate, was Smith's state of mind. On that bitter January night, he had truly believed he was face to face with a phantom. His intentions, at least in his own eyes, were not criminal. He was not out to rob, to seek revenge, or to murder. He was a frightened man acting against what he thought was a supernatural threat. Yet the law of the time offered no protection for mistaken belief. A life had been taken, and that alone, the judge argued, was murder. The ruling was harsh but clear. Ignorance and fear could not excuse homicide. If the law allowed every mistaken impression to justify violence, then chaos would follow. The jury had tried to soften this by declaring Smith guilty only of manslaughter, but the judge forced them to accept that it must be murder. It was only the king's intervention that saved Smith from the gallows. This legal rigidity meant the case echoed through British courts for decades. Whenever a defendant claimed self-defense under mistaken circumstances, the ghost of Hammersmith was invoked. Could someone who believed they were under attack, even if they were wrong, be judged by their belief or by reality? Again and again, lawyers pointed to Francis Smith as the grim example. The law said he was guilty. His mercy came not from the system, but from the crown. For nearly 2 centuries, that remained the answer. Not until the 1980s would the courts officially recognize that a mistaken belief, even if unreasonable, could sometimes form the basis for self-defense. And when that ruling finally came, legal historians looked back to Hammersmith. The ghost had not just haunted a village. It had haunted the law itself. But outside the courtroom, the legend took on a life of its own. The people of Hammersmith never stopped whispering. Some said the haunting had ended with Millwood's death, that the hysteria died when the prank was revealed. Yet others claimed that the real ghost had only begun that night, that Millwood, shot down in error, had become the restless spirit that stalked the lanes docked in taverns. Villagers shared stories, seeing him, his white clothes glowing faintly in the dark, his broken jaw forever hidden by shadow. At St. Paul's churchyard, mourners swore they felt watched. At the Black Lion pub, where his body had been carried, glasses sometimes rattled on their own. The ghost, they said, was no longer a superstition. It was Thomas himself. This belief carried a strange irony. The very act meant to rid the village of a phantom had created a new one. Francis Smith had killed no ghost that night, but many believed he had made one, and the tale grew. By the 1820s and 1830s, newspapers drew lines between the Hammersmith ghost and new terrors stalking London. Strange white figures, clawed monsters, leaping demons. The most infamous of them all was Spring-Heeled Jack. Described as tall, thin, with fiery eyes and the ability to leap over walls, Jack terrified the capital. His attacks on young women made headlines. His inhuman leaps astonished witnesses, and his legend endured for decades. To many, he was the natural heir of the Hammersmith ghost. The similarities were striking. Both were described as white or cloaked figures. Both could appear suddenly, vanish without trace, and inspire mass panic. Both blurred the line between prankster and supernatural threat. In fact, some suggested that the pranksters who once wore sheets in Hammersmith had inspired imitators in London, men who dressed as monsters to terrify the unwary. If so, then the Hammersmith ghost had not only changed the law, it had created a blueprint for urban legends. But beyond all the legends, the tragedy of Thomas Millwood remained. His name was not remembered for his trade, for the walls he built as a bricklayer, but for the way he died. He became the accidental ghost, condemned to haunt history because of superstition. His family grieved in silence. His wife left a widow. By folly, not malice. Even as scholars debated the law and storytellers embellished the haunting, the truth was simple. A young man had been in the wrong place, at the wrong time, wearing the wrong clothes. Francis Smith's own life carried the mark of that night. Though spared death, he served his year of hard labor and returned to society a broken man. Neighbors treated him with sympathy, not hatred, but he never escaped the shadow of what he had done. His story became entwined with the ghosts. Wherever the tale was told, Smith's name was mentioned not as a villain, but as a cautionary figure. The man who shot a ghost, only to find flesh and blood. And yet, perhaps what kept the story alive was not just the crime, nor the trial, nor even the ghost. It was the way the case revealed something timeless about human nature. Fear can bend perception. Panic can make shadows into monsters. And once enough people believe, even the most rational minds struggle to resist. In Hammersmith, fear had become so real that it claimed a life. And that, more than anything, was what haunted the village. Even now, the story lingers. Tourists who visit Hammersmith are told of the churchyard where Millwood fell, of the lane where Smith fired his gun, of the pub where his body was carried. The Black Lion still commemorates the event with pride, half legend, half warning. And on nights when the fog drifts heavy across the Thames, some say the figure still walks, a reminder that ghosts are not always born from death, but from belief. The Hammersmith ghost was not just a phantom in white. It was a mirror reflecting the fears of a society caught between superstition and reason. It was proof that belief itself can be dangerous, that law must sometimes wrestle with the irrational, and that tragedy can spring from shadows as easily as from men. And in the decades to come, as other legends grew in the streets of London, the shadow of Hammersmith remained an unseen figure, watching, waiting, whispering still. At the dawn of the 19th century, Britain prided itself on being an enlightened nation. Scientific discoveries were accelerating. Industry was reshaping the land, and rational thought was celebrated as the way forward. Yet the Hammersmith ghost reminded everyone that superstition was not so easily swept away. Beneath the surface of progress, fear still held a powerful grip on ordinary lives. The streets of London were alive with invention and commerce. But just beyond its borders, in places like Hammersmith, the old beliefs lingered. Villagers still spoke in whispers of restless spirits, cursed burials, and omens in the night. To them, the world was not governed by reason alone. Shadows had meaning. Death could linger. And the dead, if wronged, might return. This clash between old and new made the Hammersmith case all the more striking. On one hand, it was a story of hysteria and folklore. On the other, it became a legal milestone, debated in courtrooms and lecture halls. It revealed that even as society marched toward modernity, superstition was still shaping human actions, sometimes with deadly consequences. The villagers of Hammersmith had lived this tension firsthand. By day, they worked with tools of progress: barges and carts, blacksmiths and brewers, farmers tending orchards. By night, they locked their doors and prayed that the ghost would not find them. Rational men in daylight became trembling believers in darkness. It was as though two worlds overlapped: the enlightened age and the shadowed past. And in that overlap, tragedy struck. The story spread quickly across Britain, not only because it was sensational, but because it revealed something uncomfortable. Enlightenment had not erased fear. If anything, the ghost of Hammersmith showed that fear could thrive even in the very heart of progress. For every scientist or philosopher who dismissed the story as nonsense, there were countless ordinary people who saw in it a warning that the supernatural could not be ignored. Pamphlets and newspapers did not treat the case as mere gossip. They dissected it, moralized it, turned it into a cautionary tale. Some wrote that the villagers were fools, clinging to outdated beliefs. Others argued that the hysteria was understandable, that when enough people are terrified, even the rational mind begins to bend. A few even suggested that ghosts might indeed be real, pointing to the number of witnesses who swore they had seen the figure. This uncertainty, this refusal to fully dismiss the supernatural, is what gave the story its power. If it had been only a prank, it would have been forgotten. If it had been only a crime, it would have been judged and set aside. But it was both and more. It was a ghost story that ended in a courtroom, a legal case born from fear. It belonged to both folklore and history, neither one able to fully claim it. In the pubs of London, men debated whether Francis Smith was a murderer or a victim himself. Was he reckless, pulling the trigger too quickly? Or was he just another man ensnared by the ghost's grip, as much haunted as those who claimed to see it? In coffee houses and parlors, philosophers and lawyers debated the deeper question. What does it mean to act under belief? Can fear excuse a crime? Or does the law demand that belief and superstition have no place in justice? The answers were divided. Some believed Smith should have been punished as a murderer, regardless of his intentions. Others thought he should have been freed, for how could he be guilty when he believed he was fighting something inhuman? The king's pardon reflected this tension, neither absolute punishment nor total forgiveness. But outside the intellectual debates, the legend of the ghost continued to live in its raw, terrifying form. For villagers walking past St. Peter's graveyard, it did not matter what scholars said in London. What mattered was the feeling of being watched, the sound of footsteps echoing on empty lanes, the mist that curled around the stones like pale hands reaching upward. And so the ghost became a symbol, not just of fear, but of the thin line between belief and doubt. For every skeptic, there was someone who whispered, "What if? What if the dead do not rest? What if the man buried in consecrated ground against custom had indeed risen? What if Millwood himself now wandered the lanes, seeking justice in death that he never received in life?" These questions gave the ghost longevity. Unlike many local tales that fade in time, the Hammersmith story grew stronger with retelling. Its strange mix of superstition, tragedy, and law made it unforgettable. It was both entertainment and warning. It could be told by candlelight to frighten children, or by scholars to explore philosophy. In every form, it endured. For the people of Hammersmith, however, it was not merely a story. It was their history, etched into their streets and stones. The Black Lion pub carried whispers of it in its rafters. The churchyard bore its shadow in every leaning gravestone. The lanes themselves seemed darker, as though they remembered what had happened. A community had been scarred, not only by death, but by the realization of what fear could do. And even as the years passed, the ghost returned in new forms, sometimes a prankster in disguise, sometimes a tale of a fire-breathing phantom, sometimes an echo in the stories of Spring-Heeled Jack, always shifting, always adapting, yet always traced back to Hammersmith. The story stood at a crossroads of history. On one side, the rising tide of reason and enlightenment. On the other, the enduring grip of superstition. The ghost walked in the space between, a reminder that no matter how advanced society becomes, the human heart is never free of fear. In that way, the Hammersmith ghost was never just about one night, or one man, or one village. It was about something larger, the strange partnership between progress and superstition, between law and legend. And it asked a question that lingers still: are ghosts real, or do we create them ourselves? As the 19th century unfolded, new legends would rise, new fears would spread, and new courts would struggle with new cases. But the ghost of Hammersmith would remain, waiting in the mist, neither fully explained nor fully dismissed. And even now, 2 centuries later, its story continues to whisper, not just of phantoms in white, but of the shadows within us all. By the time the 19th century reached its middle decades, the Hammersmith ghost had already settled into legend. But legends, unlike facts, do not fade quietly. They grow, shift, and return in new guises. And though Thomas Millwood's tragic death had been real, his story was only the beginning of something much larger. Even after the trial ended and Francis Smith's punishment was decided, villagers swore the ghost still roamed the churchyard. Some nights, they claimed to see a figure drifting across Black Lion Lane, its form pale and broken, its clothes hanging loosely like burial shrouds. For many, it was obvious who this was meant to be. It was not the restless suicide once buried in consecrated ground, nor a prankster in disguise. It was Millwood himself. The irony was cruel. Millwood, who had never dressed as a ghost, who had mocked the idea of changing his work clothes to appease the fearful, now became the very phantom people imagined. His fate was sealed not just in life, but in memory. He was forever the ghost that Hammersmith never wanted. The Black Lion pub, central to so many chapters of the tale, became a focal point of the haunting. After all, it was there Millwood's body had been carried, cold and lifeless, on the night of his death. Locals began to whisper that his spirit never truly left. Glasses sometimes rattled without cause. A cold draft would sweep across the room, even with fires blazing. A few swore they saw a pale figure in the corner of their vision, vanishing the moment they turned their head. To drink at the Black Lion was to sit in the company of the ghost, and it wasn't only inside the tavern. Travelers on Black Lion Lane said they felt watched, their footsteps echoing louder than they should. The hedges seemed to close in, shadows twisting unnaturally. The mist from the Thames crept low across the road, curling like hands reaching for passing ankles. More than one villager swore they heard whispers in the fog, as though someone just behind them was breathing into the night. The stories grew, and with every retelling, the ghost's form became more elaborate. No longer just a man in white, it was said to leap into trees, vanish into walls, even chase carriages until the horses collapsed in terror. Skeptics dismissed these tales as hysteria. Believers insisted it was proof of the supernatural. For the villagers themselves, belief hardly mattered. Fear was real enough. But beyond Hammersmith, the legend took on a life of its own. London was expanding rapidly, swallowing villages, turning fields into streets, and carrying stories into every corner of the city. Tales of fire-breathing phantoms and clawed monsters began to spread, and more than once they were linked back to Hammersmith. When Spring-Heeled Jack erupted into popular imagination in the 1830s, leaping over walls, spitting blue flames, and terrifying young women, many connected him to the ghost of Hammersmith. The line between prankster and phantom blurred, and Hammersmith became remembered not just for one haunting, but as the birthplace of a new age of urban terror. For the villagers, however, the haunting remained personal. It was not about fiery eyes or leaping demons. It was about the quiet dread of walking home after sundown. It was about the graves leaning in the churchyard, the mist that clung to stone, and the memory of a man who had fallen where fear was strongest. For them, the Hammersmith ghost was not a legend. It was the shadow of their own history. Generations passed, but the story endured. Every few decades, reports would resurface. Someone would swear They had seen a figure in white, gliding between gravestones on a full moon night. Another would claim they heard the cry of a man, echoing faintly through the mist. Whether these were tricks of imagination, echoes of old tales, or something stranger, no one could prove. But the whispers never stopped. Even today, 2 centuries later, the Black Lion pub still remembers. On its walls hangs a sign telling visitors of the ghost murder, as though warning them of the history soaked into its beams. Tour guides still pause at St. Paul's churchyard, recounting the tale of the bricklayer mistaken for a phantom. And locals, though smiling as they tell it, lower their voices just a little as though still wary that the ghost may be listening. There is something powerful about such persistence. Most ghost stories fade with time. A few generations pass, and details are lost, names forgotten. But the Hammersmith ghost lingers. Perhaps because it was never only about the ghost. It was about law and justice, about fear and belief, about a community scarred by both superstition and tragedy, its roots dug deeper than folklore. It became part of history itself, and perhaps that is why the ghost is said to still appear every 50 years, on a night when the moon is full and the mist rises thickest from the Thames. Those who claim to have seen it describe a man in white, face shadowed, moving silently among the graves. Some say it is the restless suicide, forever cursed for being buried on holy ground. Others insist it is Millwood, still wandering the lane, where he died, waiting for someone to finally give him peace. The truth remains elusive. Was there ever truly a ghost in Hammersmith? Or was it always fear, shaping shadows into specters? The villagers of 1803 believed it enough to change their lives. Francis Smith believed it enough to fire his gun. And in the centuries since, countless people have believed it enough to keep telling the tale. Perhaps that is the real haunting. Not the figure in white, but the way the story itself refuses to rest. Once a ghost is born in memory, it is harder to banish than any spirit in the graveyard. It drifts through generations, clinging to words, whispers, and fears. It waits in the mist, patient and timeless, always ready to rise again when darkness falls. And so, in Hammersmith, as the river flows on and the city grows around it, the ghost still lingers, not just in shadows, but in history. Not just in mist, but in memory. Always there, always waiting. As the years stretched on, the Hammersmith ghost faded from newspaper headlines, but it never truly left the minds of those who lived in the shadow of its legend. Fear, after all, has a way of lingering long after the cause is gone. The lanes of Hammersmith still carried its memory, and the villagers still felt its weight. Even after Francis Smith's trial had ended, the ghost became something larger than the sum of its sightings. It was no longer just a figure drifting through the mist, nor only the tragedy of a man mistaken for a phantom. It had become a symbol, a reminder of how easily human fear can spiral into disaster, how superstition can take flesh and lead to blood. The story haunted conversations in Hammersmith. Parents used it to frighten children into staying indoors after dark. Travelers spoke of it as a warning urging caution on lonely roads. Local workers mentioned it in passing, sometimes with nervous laughter, sometimes with unease. To outsiders, it was entertainment. To those who lived there, it was history. And what made it worse was that the ghost never truly went away. Sightings were still whispered. On moonlit nights, villagers claimed they glimpsed something pale slipping between gravestones. A shadow with no face, a man with no voice. Sometimes it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Sometimes it followed for a few steps before melting into the mist. Most dismissed these encounters as tricks of light or imagination. But for those who experienced them, the terror was real. In truth, the fear was never only about the ghost. It was about what the ghost represented, the unknown. In an age of progress and reason, when London was racing toward industry and science, Hammersmith reminded people that the old fears still lived, that enlightenment had not erased the shadows, that a village could be torn apart, not by war or famine, but by whispers in the dark. The Black Lion pub became the beating heart of this memory. Travelers stopped there to drink, locals gathered, there to tell stories. The tavern itself seemed to carry the ghost in its walls. Some nights, as laughter filled the room, a sudden hush would fall when someone mentioned the murder. The air grew colder. The crackle of the fire seemed louder. For many, it was as though the pub itself remembered the body laid upon its floor. What is most striking is how the story was shaped by belief. The ghost had no single form. For some, it was a pale, shrouded man. For others, a monstrous creature, with horns or glowing eyes. Still others swore it looked like Napoleon himself. The inconsistency did not weaken the legend, it made it stronger. The ghost became a vessel for fear itself, capable of taking whatever form the frightened mind imagined. And this is perhaps why it endured. Ghosts are not always bound to graves or corpses. Sometimes they are born from belief. The Hammersmith ghost was less a spirit than a reflection of the villagers' terror. Once the fear had been planted, it grew roots deep in the community. And when Francis Smith fired his gun that January night, belief became reality. The ghost had taken its first life, not because it was real, but because people believed it. This is what makes the Hammersmith case so chilling. It was not merely a story of superstition. It was proof of how dangerous belief can be when it is strong enough. A prank, a rumor, a shadow in the mist, any of these on their own might have faded, but combined with fear, they became lethal. A man lay dead, not because of a ghost, but because of the power of belief in one. And even as courts debated the legal meaning, even as scholars used the case to argue about law and reason, the villagers carried the deeper lesson, that fear itself can kill, yet despite this, they could not let the story go. The ghost was retold in taverns, in newspapers, in drawing rooms across London. With each telling, details shifted. Sometimes the ghost strangled its victims. Sometimes it chased women across the fields. Sometimes it melted into the earth or leapt over hedges like a beast. These changes did not weaken the tale, they kept it alive. Like smoke, the ghost slipped into whatever shape the story required. And as decades passed, its shadow stretched further. The figure of Springfield, Jack, terrorizing London in the 1830s and beyond, carried echoes of Hammersmith. The pale figure in white had transformed into a leaping, flame-spitting demon. The details changed, but the fear remained the same. From graveyards to rooftops, the ghost's legacy lived on. Back in Hammersmith, though, the haunting was quieter. It lived in silence, in mist, in the unease of late-night walks. The churchyard, with its leaning stones and curling fog, never lost its reputation. Few dared linger there after dark. Children whispered dares to each other. Who would be brave enough to cross Black Lion Lane alone at midnight? Most refused. Those who tried often returned pale, swearing they had seen or heard something they could not explain. Perhaps that is why the ghost still matters. It was never only about what people saw, but about what they felt. The chill in the air, the silence. In the mist, the unease of shadows shifting in the dark. These were the things that made the ghost real. Long after the trial, long after King George's pardon, long after the law had made its ruling, the fear still walked the lanes, and in truth it walks them still. For every generation, the story is told anew. Tourists come to hear it, locals repeat it, books and documentaries revive it. Each time the ghost rises again, stepping out from the mist to remind listeners of the night fear itself pulled the trigger. The Hammersmith ghost was not banished by law, nor by reason. It loves because belief gave it life. And as long as people believe, as long as they whisper the tale, the ghost will never die. In this way, Hammersmith was never just a village haunted by a phantom. It was a village haunted by itself, by the fear that turned shadows into spirits, by the hysteria that turned a man into a ghost, and by the tragedy that turned superstition into blood. The weight of that fear still hangs in the air, even now. You can feel it in the quiet lanes, in the churchyard stones, in the stories told at the Black Lion. It is more than a ghost story. It is a reminder of how easily we are haunted, not by the dead, but by our own belief. And that, perhaps, is the most terrifying ghost of all. By the mid-19th century, the story of the Hammersmith ghost had already taken on a strange immortality. Though decades had passed since Francis Smith fired his fatal shot, the tale showed no signs of fading. Instead, it spread further, shaping new legends, feeding old fears, and reminding everyone that once a ghost is born in the public imagination, it is almost impossible to lay it to rest. It began, as many enduring legends do, with retelling. Parents shared the story with their children, perhaps as a cautionary tale, perhaps simply for the thrill of seeing eyes widen in the candlelight. The details shifted with each generation. Some versions kept close to the truth. A man mistaken for a phantom, killed in the mist of Black Lion Lane. Others leaned into horror. A ghostly figure strangling travelers, shrieking in the graveyard, clawing at windows when the wind howled. The truth and the fiction blended until it no longer mattered. The tragedy of Thomas Millwood, the real man behind the ghost, was largely forgotten in these retellings. Instead, he became only the phantom. In white, the restless spirit said to wander forever. The irony was cruel. The man who had mocked the idea of changing his bricklayer's clothes was remembered not as a worker, a husband, or a brother, but as the ghost who haunted Hammersmith. Death had stripped him of his identity and replaced it with legend. Meanwhile, Francis Smith remained etched into history, not as a citizen or a husband, but as the man who shot a ghost. His fate was remembered less for the details of his punishment than for the legal questions his trial had raised. For scholars, he became a symbol of law's struggle with human belief. For villagers, he was the man whose fear had taken a life. Together, Smith and Millwood were bound forever, one as victim, one as killer, both as characters in a ghost story larger than themselves. But while the courtrooms debated, the public dreamed. The ghost's form began to evolve, finding new life in the streets of London. The 1830s brought reports of Spring-Heeled Jack, a figure as terrifying as any phantom, leaping impossibly high, breathing fire, attacking young women in the dark. To many, Jack was simply the Hammersmith ghost reborn. The city's imagination had taken one legend and transformed it into another, more monstrous, more fitting for the industrial age's growing fears. In this way, Hammersmith's phantom had escaped the boundaries of its own story. It was no longer just about a village, a pub, or a churchyard. It had become a pattern, a template for urban terror. Each new decade seemed to summon a fresh horror, but in the background, the shadow of Hammersmith lingered. Every phantom in white, every figure leaping over walls, every spectral sighting in the fog, was measured against the ghost that had started it all. Even as London grew into a sprawling metropolis, swallowing villages like Hammersmith, the ghost held its ground. The Black Lion pub proudly told the tale to curious visitors. Guides pointed to the churchyard where Millwood had been buried and whispered that his spirit still lingered. On certain nights, when the mist rolled in heavy from the Thames, locals swore the figure could still be seen. Some described it drifting silently between gravestones. Others claimed it stood motionless at the edge of the lane, waiting for travelers to pass too close. For skeptics, the persistence of the story was proof of nothing more than human imagination. Ghosts, they argued, do not survive centuries stories do. Fear travels faster than fact, and once a tale lodges in memory, it can last forever. But for believers, the endurance of the Hammersmith ghost was evidence of the opposite, that something truly lingered there, something that could not be explained or banished. Each new sighting was taken as proof that the story was more than legend. This divide between skeptics and believers mirrored the very tension that had existed when the ghost first appeared. In 1803, villagers had lived between reason and superstition, between daylight work and nighttime terror. Decades later, that balance had not shifted much. Enlightenment had not erased fear. Progress had not silenced whispers. The ghost still walked, because the human mind still carried shadows. What makes the Hammersmith ghost so haunting, even after centuries, is not just the story itself, but what it reveals about us. It shows how belief can shape reality. A prankster in white sheets can terrify an entire community if fear is strong enough. A man in work clothes can be mistaken for a phantom and killed. And a story, once told, can become more powerful than fact, outlasting even the people who lived it. In Hammersmith, fear gave birth to a ghost. In London, imagination gave it new faces. And in history, it became a symbol of how tightly superstition and progress remain bound together. Today, the story is told less as a warning and more as entertainment. Ghost tours included in their roots. Historians dissect it as a case study. In law and folklore, paranormal enthusiasts treat it as proof that spirits walk among us. Each telling serves a different purpose, but all keep the ghost alive. And that may be the final truth of Hammersmith, that the ghost was never simply about what people saw. It was about what they believed. It was about the way fear reshaped perception, the way imagination gave form to shadows, the way tragedy became legend. A ghost does not have to be real to haunt. Sometimes a story is enough. And in Hammersmith, the story refuses to die. On quiet nights, when the mist curls low and the lamps flicker in the wind, some say you can still hear it. The sound of footsteps in an empty lane, the rustle of cloth in the fog, the faint, broken cry of a man mistaken for a phantom. Echoes of a fear that has never left, echoes of a legend that refuses to fade. The Hammersmith ghost, born in superstition, hardened in tragedy, and immortalized in history, still walks the line between past and present. And as long as people tell the tale, it always will. Time has a way of softening the sharp edges of tragedy. Wars end, disasters fade, and names once spoken with grief are eventually forgotten. But every so often, a story refuses to sink into silence. It lingers like smoke in the rafters, clinging to memory long after the fire is gone. The Hammersmith ghost is one such story. More than 200 years have passed since that fateful January night when Francis Smith raised his musket in the mist and fired at what he believed was a phantom. And yet, the echoes of that shot still ring in the shadows of Hammersmith. For what began as a rumor of a ghost became a legend, and what became a legend soon became history. The most unsettling truth of the Hammersmith ghost is that it was never just one thing. It was not merely a spirit haunting a graveyard. It was not merely a prankster dressing to frighten neighbors. It was not merely a legal case debated in court. It was all of these things at once and more. It was a mirror reflecting back the fears of an entire community, and later, an entire nation. The story was born out of unease. Villagers frightened by tales of a suicide buried on holy ground. The fear grew in the misty lanes, whispered at the fireside, carried from door to door until it had a life of its own. When shadows stretched across Black Lion Lane, the imagination turned them into ghosts. And when Francis Smith pulled the trigger, imagination crossed into reality. A man lay dead, and the ghost, whether real or not, had claimed its victim. But the ghost's true power was not in its form, but in its endurance. Long after Thomas Millwood's body was laid in the earth, long after Francis Smith's punishment was handed down, the ghost kept walking. It appeared in stories, in newspapers, in songs and pamphlets. It haunted not only Hammersmith, but London itself, morphing into new phantoms with each generation. And even now, the ghost lives on. The Black Lion pub still tells its story to visitors who come seeking a brush with the past. The lanes and graveyards are still walked by those who swear they feel a presence in the mist. And scholars, historians, and paranormal enthusiasts alike continue to debate what truly happened. Perhaps the Hammersmith ghost endures because it carries lessons too important to forget. It teaches that fear itself can be deadly, that superstition can blind reason, and that once belief takes root, it can shape reality in terrifying ways. A man died not because of a ghost, but because others believed too strongly in one. And in that sense, the ghost was real enough. It also leaves us with deeper questions, ones that reach beyond Hammersmith and into the very nature of human experience. What do we fear most? The shadows outside, or the shadows within us? Do ghosts walk among us, or do we create them ourselves, born from guilt, fear, and imagination? Can we ever truly banish a legend once it has been given life? The answers may never be clear, but perhaps that is why the Hammersmith ghost continues to fascinate. It is not a story with an ending, but a story that loops endlessly, circling back with every retelling, every shiver in the mist, every whispered dare in the churchyard at midnight. If you walk through Hammersmith today, you will find modern streets, bright lights, and the hum of city life. Yet beneath it all, the past stirs. The graveyard still stands, its stones worn and leaning. The Black Lion still serves drinks beneath its beams, and the mist still curls off the Thames, creeping into alleys just as it did 2 centuries ago. On such nights, when the fog lies thick and the moon glows faint above the rooftops, some say you can feel it, the weight of eyes in the dark, sound of footsteps that do not belong to you, the faint outline of a figure watching from the edge of the lane. Is it only imagination? A trick of nerves? Or is it the ghost still wandering the place where fear gave it birth? In the end, the truth hardly matters. For the Hammersmith ghost is no longer confined to one churchyard, one lane, or 1 century. It lives wherever stories are told, wherever fear finds fertile ground, wherever shadows stir suspicion in the human heart. It has become more than a haunting. It has become a symbol of fear, of tragedy, of belief. And so the legend endures. The musket has long since fallen silent. The villagers who once trembled in the night are dust in their graves. But the story remains, whispered in pubs, repeated by guides, studied by scholars, and carried by those who dare to walk alone in the mist. The ghost of Hammersmith does not rest because we will not let it. As long as fear is part of us, as long as imagination can turn shadows into specters, the ghost will never die. It waits still in the mist. It watches in the silence. And when you least expect it, on a quiet night in Hammersmith, it may walk again.